The story begins with a workaholic salaryman exhausted by his stressful and hectic city life. After a long day in his corporate job, he closes his eyes to rest, only to find himself waking up in another world as Van Nefertio, the young son of a nobleman. Looking at his small hands, Van realizes he's now a child. Unsure on what's going on, he decided to peek through the window and was immediately amazed by the massive garden surrounding the mansion he is in. A gentle voice then calls for his name, sounding worried that he might fall over. As Van turns around, he finally meets Till, his personal maid in this world. As they talk, Van discovers that while his memories from his past life remain clear, he also holds memories of his life in this world, which made him finally realize that he has been reincarnated. At breakfast, Van witnesses the stern authority of his father, Marquis Jalpa Bal Ati Ferdio, who questions his other sons, Mersha Alego Ferdio, Jard Guy Ferdio, and Sesto Ale Ferdio about their training. When Van was finally asked, Van surprises everyone with his mature response, telling everyone that he wants to learn more about culture and history. This catches the Marquis off guard, yet also gives him hints that Van might be a prodigy and may have inherited powerful fire magic from his mother, Mira. In this world, one's magical affinity, be it fire, water, wind, earth, or healing, defines a person's worth and standing. While all Ferdio family members have awakened powers, Van is the only one that hasn't yet. Determined to improve, Van studies intensely and trains his swordsmanship skills with Esparta, the head butler of the mansion. Eventually, 2 years have finally passed and Van impresses everyone by defeating older boys in combat. This is all thanks to the skills he learned from his past life, such as judo and karate. Despite his strength, Van remains humble and well-mannered, causing everyone to admire him even more. One day, Deputy Knight Commander D goes on to examine Van's hands, surprised to find no calluses at all. Van explains his time is mostly spent studying, causing D to get amazed by him even more. Because of this, D offers to train him personally, even promising to make him the greatest swordsman this kingdom has ever seen. But Van politely declines his offer to train him full-time, saying he enjoys studying and swordplay equally, and will pursue both in his own way. But with D's persistent persuasion, Van eventually accepted D's offer for direct sword training, only to discover D, like Esparta, is merciless in teaching him. Still, Van finds this chaotic life far more fulfilling than his previous one. For the first time, he feels truly alive, and he resolves to become the best nobleman he can be. As Van grows older, he and Till visit the town market for Van to take a break from his grueling routine of study and training. Now hailed as a prodigy, Van stands out too much, and he starts to feel a bit suffocated about it. Even Till thinks he may surpass his older brothers and inherit the house, which unsettles Van so much. In the noble world, power brings danger, and as the head of the house controls wealth and influence, rivals may not hesitate to eliminate competition, even if they are family. With growing tension between him and his brothers, Van decides it's safer to stop drawing attention to himself and decides to act like a normal child by enjoying a simple day of shopping. In the bustling market, they arrive at the Merry Chamber of Commerce, a huge building with branches of stores from across the kingdom. Just before entering, they encounter a cruel sight: a man dragging a boy by a rope like an animal, to which Van immediately demands an explanation. The man, seeing Van's noble status, explains that he's using his son to pay off a debt by selling him into slavery. Though Van knows slavery exists in this world, may it be for debts or punishment, it still horrifies him to witness happening in real life. But with no legal power to stop it, Van walks on, disturbed by how normalized this cruelty seems. Inside the store, Rosalie, a sales attendant, rushes to help them after learning Van is from the Marquis family. Meanwhile, the abusive father grows visibly anxious, so Van decides to ask Rosalie about the slave boy's price. Rosalie examines the boy and notes he's at the age when magical aptitudes are already awakened. When asked about the boy's affinity, the father revealed it is thieving magic. Rosalie explains this rare magic is not among the accepted major affinities and estimates the boy's worth at just 3 silver coins, which is less than the 5 coins the father was looking forward to having. Furious, the man begins to beat his son publicly. As the scene escalates, Van steps in and pays 5 large silver coins, buying the boy himself by giving the man what he wanted. Shocked, the crowd watches as the man takes the money and leaves without even looking back at his son. Van approaches the boy, asking if he's hurt, to which the boy replies that he's fine. Eventually, the boy introduces himself as Kamshin, and after knowing this, without hesitation, Van tells him he's free to go wherever he wants. Till then grew nervous and immediately asked her master if it is wise to let Kamshin go, given that he was bought as a slave. After considering how his father would react, Van asked Kamshin if he wanted to come to their mansion instead and work there as a helper. After much consideration, Kamshin accepted Van's offer, and they eventually formed a slave contract to legitimize everything. With Rosalie's help, Kamshin's palm has now been engraved with a glowing mark, signifying that he is now Van's slave. Before heading back, Van and the others decided to shop for some clothes first. Inside the commerce chamber, Rosalie suggested cheap clothes for Kamshin, but Van insisted on buying the best quality products, as he didn't want to treat Kamshin like a typical slave. After hours of shopping, they finally made it back to the mansion where Kamshin looked more refined and put together than he was before. When Deputy Commander D came looking for Van, Kamshin, who is now so loyal to Van, decided to lie to the commander to hide his master, while munching on a cookie Van used to bribe him. But despite that, D still found them in the end. Impressed by Kamshin's composure and loyalty, D offered to train him. While it definitely made Kamshin excited, Van felt guilty, knowing D's training would be brutally painful. But eventually, Kamshin ends up training with D, while Van is just watching them from the balcony. During his time alone, Van really hopes that he'll be able to lose his prodigy image and live a more normal life. Years have then passed, and Van, the once hailed prodigy, shocked everyone during his magical aptitude test when he was revealed to have production magic, which is a skill seen as useless among nobles. Unlike elemental or healing magic, production magic, or alchemy, is looked down upon by many people since even non-magical blacksmiths can craft better without using mana. Because of this, Van's father, the Marquis, was so furious as he had hoped Van would inherit his late mother's powerful fire magic, especially since her death was caused by Van's overwhelming mana at birth. Feeling disgraced and betrayed, the Marquis declared Van unworthy of the Ferdio name, and to avoid further embarrassment to the noble house, he decided to cast Van out of the mansion entirely. Before the situation worsened, Van's eldest brother, Mersha, intervened and convinced their father to send Van to a nameless village within their territory instead of completely disowning him. With his reputation shattered and no place left in the mansion, Van just accepted his fate and was quietly exiled from the noble household. Mersha immediately knelt before Van, apologizing for his drastic suggestion. As someone who had suffered for his wind magic, Mersha couldn't stand to see bad things happen to Van at his age just because he acquired a useless magic. Seeing how Mersha is so genuine towards him, Van assures her brother that there is nothing to be apologetic about. In fact, Van even thinks that he should be the one to thank Mersha, since if it wasn't for him, Van might already have been murdered by their father or be confined in some random prison, or worse, he might have been sold into slavery. That is why, as despairing as this situation is, Van assures his brother that he will make sure that he won't waste the opportunity he gave him. Hearing how mature Van sounds, Mersha couldn't help but wonder where his brother even learned all of this. Although Mersha doesn't doubt his brother's capabilities, he still went on to extend his hand and told his brother that in case he needed help, he would always be there to offer his assistance. Moments later, when Van's personal servants learned about what happened to him, they all sadly expressed their own opinions of the situation, stating that Van is a smart and splendid nobleman, and that they don't care what kind of magic he has. Specifically, Till couldn't help but release her frustration regarding the decision of the Marquis to ship Van off to some remote village. Despite the fact that he literally got exiled to some unknown place, Van sees this as an opportunity to finally be free from the stuffy rules and lifestyle of the nobility. In fact, he loves the idea that he is actually able to do this, especially after finding out that country lords barely have anything to do, which simply means he has a ton of free time on his own. Aside from that, Van also plans that once he is there, he'll make it his ideal place to live in relaxation. The moving day finally came, and Van is getting all the carriages ready for them to finally leave. After introducing himself to some adventurers that Mersha hired who would guard them throughout the trip, who were actually quite surprised that Van is approachable and friendly, Van went ahead and took care of the rest. Although the initial plan was to head to the nameless village with only the guards and Kamshin on his side, Van was surprised to find out that Till, Isparta, and Dee actually insisted on coming with him. Till negotiated with the Marquis to join Van in his new place since she is his personal maid, after all. Fortunately, the news of Van's magical aptitude results was suppressed from the public. and those who know about it are subject to a gag order. Because of this, somehow, the secret managed to stay under wraps. But Van didn't really expect that Dee, among all people, would also want to join him in his new journey in a new village. Dee explains that he plans on teaching Van every last bit of his sword fighting techniques. While Dee is laughing, so excited about tackling their next journey, Van suddenly experiences a midlife crisis. Despite the fact that knights aren't supposed to come with them, Dee doesn't care about that and even orders 2 of his men, Arb and Lo, to get themselves ready to go as well. But aside from Dee, Esparta also joined the fun, informing Van that he had already told the Marquis that he'd be retiring early, only for him to join Van in the countryside. Van's sunken expression really showcases how unexpected all of this is for him. He knows well that his father wouldn't easily let go of Esparta, who has worked at his side for so many years now. Seeing all of them work together, Van wonders if they conspired to make all of this happen, making him somehow think that these people really love teasing him so badly that they'd actually follow him to a nameless, remote village. But he can't deny the fact that having a strong fighter like Dee and a familiar face like Esparta nearby is definitely reassuring, and Van himself can't stop smiling like crazy. At this point, Van had already acknowledged the fact that he really was anxious about getting sent to the boonies. But thankfully, with everyone wanting to join him, Van couldn't be happier. He tried his best to give them the option to stay in the mansion, but despite his efforts, almost everyone in the group decided to join him, no matter what. As they finally leave the town, the carriage that Van is riding on doesn't have their family crest, which is something that his father made sure not to put so that no one in town will know he is leaving. Although Van sees this as a new opportunity to find freedom, he still couldn't help but feel a bit sad since he did have some good memories playing in town during the past 2 years, when he thought everything was going smoothly. As they reached the town's gate, Dee and his men started calling everyone's attention, informing them that the 4th son of the Marquis was now leaving. Despite his father's strict orders of not telling anyone about his departure, Dee decided not to follow the Lord's order and give Van the grandest send-off ever. Although nervous about how his father would react, Van couldn't contain his emotions after he saw how the people were cheering for him, giving him the happiest and most genuine goodbye, while also wishing him a safe trip. Van tried his best to hold it together, but he ended up breaking down like a baby. Till didn't really help, since she herself was crying non-stop with her teary eyes. Eventually, Van and his team passed through 2 towns, then finally set up their first campground. Although he has experience sleeping in vehicles from his previous life, but this is his first time camping in a dangerous world where magic beasts dwell. 2 adventuring parties were retained to guard them during their travels, with Ortho Sheet being their leader. Aside from being a leader, Ortho is also known as an efficient adventurer who has been in the business for over 20 years. Because of his experience in negotiating with questers, Van finds it amazing how good Ortho is with talking so articulately and professionally, even with a young man like him. Little did Van know that Ortho himself is quite amazed at him as well. Although Van doesn't have the slightest idea of how people perceive him, Till was quick to notice that the adventurers also see the good in Van. Eventually, over the next 2 weeks, the group traveled around 50 to 100 kilometers per day, which totals to around 500 and 1,000 kilometers of land area that the Marquis owns. As Van thinks of the situation more deeply, it somehow reminds him of when his boss would transfer him to a different sales office. Correlating it to his previous life, Van decided to make sure that he made a positive first impression with everyone in the village. But to their surprise, as they finally arrived at their destination, they found out that the village was actually under attack. Before practically entering the village, Van went on to talk with everyone first, trying to formulate a good plan. Based on how it looks, a bunch of bandits or wannabe mercenaries are trying to collect weak links inside the village. Though the village is surrounded by a sturdy fence made of thick logs, it isn't terribly effective against arrows since they can arc up and over. To make it all worse, the bandits are also in tough-looking armor, lined up in front of the gate with a bunch of mages lined up behind them. At this point, Van knows that the villagers are probably trying their best to protect the village like a turtle inside its shell. Since they are up against 40 to 50 armed men, Van is thinking of initiating a surprise attack. However, for some reason, both Dee and Ortho are arguing whether they should fight or not. Dee, in particular, really wants to fight for Van's sake, but Ortho is not willing to sacrifice his men, even if the Marquis pays them more. For a fight they are not sure they'd win. Since the conversation is getting longer and tenser than expected, Esparta decided to step in and help the group. He went on to inform everyone that although he may look a bit rusty considering his age, but he is actually pretty useful during battle as he is an elemental magician. Based on his observation, the ground in this area is raw and exposes the earth, which gives them the advantage during the fight. Esparta then went on to suggest that he would first erect a defensive wall so that the adventurers could remain behind that wall and engage in long-range attacks. So when the enemies turn their attention to them, D and his knights can attack from the other side. Esparta personally thinks that the more surprises there are, the more likely they are to win. However, Ortho can't help but wonder if Esparta can defend them against magic, since whether it's an arrow or a spell that strikes him, they might lose their defenses. Esparta then suggested to Ortho and his team that if they want to, as they finish the first surprise attack, they can use the carriage to escape since it is strategically plated with iron. After all, the initial goal is to turn the enemy's attention in their direction for D to be able to execute the plan smoothly. Meanwhile, as Van listens to their conversation, he finally decides to ask Esparta if he is willing to stay and fight. Esparta didn't even hesitate to answer the young lord, stating that he would stay no matter what, since if you don't continue to attack from behind the wall and act as a decoy, D and the knights might die in vain. After hearing this, Van couldn't possibly let Esparta do such a fatal sacrifice, since if he continues with the plan, he might actually be the one dying in the end. Although Esparta is pretty determined on it. Instead of listening, Van surprised everyone when he suggested that he would like to be used as a decoy. Immediately, Till and Kamshin volunteered to become decoys instead, with Till trying to stop her master, Van, from pushing through his plans. However, as the new leader of the village, Van personally thinks that he should be the one taking care of the situation and finding a solution for the sake of the people. Aside from that, Van also didn't want to bother the adventurers by asking them to do more than what they were hired for. On top of that, considering Esparta has already retired and has done too much for the Marquillas, Van didn't want to burden him anymore since he also deserves some rest. The knights, being part of the house's chivalric order, simply means that they still serve Van's father and not Van, so if something happens to them, it would affect Van in many ways. Van also didn't want to put Till in a dangerous situation, as she had been with Van longer than anyone else, so for Van, Till is like an older sister he never had. And lastly, Van also didn't want to see Kamshin die, even if he is just termed as a slave. Since for Van, Kamshin is as free as any human in this world, and he doesn't want to see him die that easily. Because of Van's kind words, everyone started sobbing like crazy, specifically Till and Kamshin. Although Van was labeled incompetent and chased out of the Marquillas' household, but to think that these people willingly followed him, Van simply can't let such wonderful, kind people die here no matter what. Just like what he promised himself, he won't be like his awful boss, who just gives orders and does nothing to contribute. As the responsible person here, Van just felt like he needed to take the lead or he'll be a disgrace to the people who followed him. So to ensure that their plan works out well, Van plans to ride the carriage and approach the bandits from the front, and he wants everyone to attack from both sides in a pincer formation. But he still reminds everyone not to overdo it with the ranged attacks, and in cases where the enemy doesn't retreat, he wants everyone to run away as soon as possible. At this point, Van is willing to go all in and sacrifice himself for the sake of the people. Since this is the first time that the adventurers met a noble who is so genuine and kind, Ortho finally decided to fight as well. Even Orthos member Pluriel was so amazed by Van's maturity and humility that she couldn't possibly let this child fight on his own. With that being said, in the end, the whole group ended up willingly sacrificing themselves for Van. Now that they already had a concrete plan for the attack, they went ahead and just followed it through. While D and Orthos teams attack on each side, Kamshin and Till are on standby to offer first aid in case someone gets injured. On the other hand, just as Esparta promised, he went on to use his elemental skill to build an earth defense wall, which gave everyone the advantage to take over the fight. As everyone is busy doing their own tasks, Ortho was asked by his teammate if he was actually willing to risk his life for Van. Without even thinking twice, Ortho answered by revealing that he wants to see Van become the next king of the country. For the past 2 weeks, Van has completely changed Orthos' impression of what nobles could be. Van snagged his interest to the point that he couldn't believe a noble could be like him. He was so impressed that he knew he'd help him if he ran into trouble with his new role. But he thinks that he still has a lot of things to learn from Van. Despite him forcibly becoming the feudal lord of a puny village with a shady history under troubled and murky circumstances, Van still acted on his responsibility as a noble and put his life on the line. On top of that, the fact that Van proposed a plan that not only protects the civilians and the land, but also the lives of his men, Ortho can't help but admire him so much. And just like that, the group went ahead and started the fight. Dee and Ortho's group went on to attack from the side while Van and his team waited behind the wall. As the knights and the adventurers take down as many bandits as they can, some of these bandits just decide to retreat. While the rest are busy fighting, Orthos noticed that some of the bulky-looking enemies are now heading towards the wall. Meanwhile, at the wall, Pluriel was taken aback when the bandits sneakily tried to attack them from above. She almost got murdered if it weren't for Van's help. The young man didn't even hesitate and went on to attack the bandit, who is quadruple his size, using his sword. Witnessing how smoothly Van attacked the enemies made Pluriel wonder if this noble is really a kid or not. Eventually, Van and his team managed to defeat the enemies in no time. Although a few of the bandits got away, they're still happy that they were able to wipe out the enemies without sustaining any injuries. At this point, now that their tasks as guards have finally come to an end, the adventurers, especially Ortho, decided to stay here for now, even if they don't get paid for it at all. Pluriel, as well as the other members of Ortho's party, also decided to tag along with him for the purpose of wanting to know more about Van and who he truly is. Pluriel went ahead and stated that Van doesn't strike her as a noble, but she can't say if he's a normal kid either. Even Ortho thinks the same way when he finally notices how strangely quick-witted and full of guts Van is, a characteristic that is not normal for kids, even for a kid with a noble's education usually would have. At first glance, Van has the elegance of a noble, but when he opens his mouth, he destroys that impression. Aside from being polite and mindful, Van is also familiar and friendly with normal townspeople and doesn't look at civilians as if they are lesser than him. Considering this is the first time Ortho feels like he is seeing what a noble with resolve really looks like, he would really do everything to know more about him. So, in cases that Van becomes a lord of a large territory, Ortho would love to see what kind of place he'd turn it into. So without hesitation, Ortho and his party decided to stay and help Van for a bit. Meanwhile, Till can't stop crying while begging Van not to risk his life again, and even suggested that he risk her life first before anyone else. Although Van kept on nodding to agree, Till knows very well that he is not listening at all. On the other hand, Kamshin is now more motivated to become stronger for the sake of his master, Van. In the midst of this emotional chaos, Pluriel steps in and asks Van if he has a minute to spare. Without hesitation, Pluriel asks Van if there is a chance that he is an elf or something, since she finds it odd that Van sometimes doesn't act his age at all. Although Pluriel asks this question in the most casual tone ever, that didn't even bother Van at all, and he goes on to answer Pluriel's question, assuring her that he is positive he is just a normal human, considering Till has taken care of him since he was a baby. When asked regarding his swordsmanship and practical skills, Van didn't even hesitate to reveal that it was all because of Dee and Esparta's never-ending lessons. Now that Pluriel has finally understood where Van is coming from, Pluriel goes ahead and thanks Van for his help, since with his actions and sword, she was saved from almost getting murdered. But instead of using this as a reason to make Pluriel feel indebted, Van is quick to assure her that she can let it go now, showcasing that everything he does is genuine. At this point, Pluriel admired the young noble even more, ultimately capturing her heart. Now that everything has already been taken care of, Esparta then informs his young master that the villagers have gathered around the entrance already. Since they are already off schedule, Van together with everyone didn't waste a minute and goes on to meet the villagers for the first time with an aim to make it one for the history books. Behind the massive wooden wall, a small village with a number of small houses is seen. When Van finally arrived, while the villagers were dead silent, Van went ahead and showed them one of his brightest smiles while introducing himself as the newly appointed reigning lord of this territory. After finally informing everyone that he'll be the one managing things hereabouts from now on, the village mayor, Rhonda, also went on to express his utmost gratitude towards Van and his men for saving their village. As the newly appointed leader of the territory, Van apologizes to the mayor for the lack of soldiers dispatched here to protect the village. That is why, moving forward, as the new lord, he promises to do his utmost to protect the village while asking for everyone's understanding and cooperation. After that rather salesman-like introduction, the mayor then invites Van over to his house to talk more. According to the mayor, originally, 150 people called this village home. But 6 months ago, bandits attacked, and again a month later, causing the village to have but 110 residents left. Today marks the third time they've been assaulted by these bandits. To make matters worse, each attack was at the hands of a separate group of brigands, making Van wonder what this village has that is being targeted frequently. The mayor speculated that since they are near the border with the kingdom of Yeleneta, when this land was still part of Count Ferdinando's domain, he regularly sent his knights to patrol the border. But under Van's replacement, the village was ultimately abandoned, which, in other words, because of Marquis Ferdio taking over, the village is on the verge of being wiped out. After hearing this, Van immediately apologized for what his father may have caused. But if he were to defend his father, the Marquis only sent governors to manage the larger ones. To this day, he has very little idea what transpires in smaller villages like this. The mayor then shuts Van down, stating that the Marquis was pretty clear when he stated that a village like this is nothing but an afterthought for him, adding that a tiny hamlet that cannot even reliably pay its taxes is not worth protecting at all. Realizing that the village has now lost hope because of the Marquis, Van tried his best to calm everyone out without compromising anyone's feelings. In fact, Van doesn't discourage anyone from complaining about how this country does things, but he did remind everyone that resentment and lamentation won't help in the slightest. Although he is sure that it's no consolation, but the villagers' feelings won't cause anything to change. Now this obviously made the villagers furious, especially the mayor's son, Moraga. However, Van handled the situation smoothly and maturely, since for him, the betterment of the village is what's important. Shocking everyone, Van went ahead and started to talk ill about the royal family and the nobles himself. He then tried to make everyone feel comfortable with him, assuring them that as the feudal lord of the village, whether the danger comes from bandits or the royal family itself, he needs to ensure that they all take 3 preventive actions. First, they must create value in this town that the kingdom cannot ignore. Second, they must also save up funding to hire mercenaries. And lastly, they must remodel and develop the village themselves. But everyone knows that it's a lot easier to imagine those things than to put them into practice. After all, in a remote region like this, even selling materials like wood and stone wouldn't turn much profit, due to the transport costs involved. Creating market value with crafted goods is also difficult when so much of the population has no proper education. Aside from that, the people have no clear means of making money as well, and lack the knowledge on how to renovate their village. But that is exactly where Van and his team come in. With the knowledge he was able to acquire from his noble studies, he promised to give all of his effort into making this village thrive. Although this is such a promising statement, the mayor together with the rest of the villagers couldn't help but stay silent. Seeing how the villagers are having the hard time believing Van's words, Esparta steps in to further persuade the people. As someone who has worked as a butler for the Marquis and the Ferdios family, Esparta assured everyone that Van is a bona fide genius, entrusted with the territory at such a young age. Esparta also didn't forget to mention that Van is known as a young prodigy practically since he started talking. To better solidify his statement, Esparta also mentioned D, the deputy commander of the chivalric order, who readily volunteered to serve Van now. With this, Esparta is hoping that the village will finally consider Van as the leader they could trust in the long run. Hearing about such big names, the mayor and the others are starting to feel a bit emotional just thinking that the Marquis must have sent them aid, relieved that with Van's supposedly powerful elemental magic, they'd be able to win any fights from now on. However, Van immediately shattered their hopefulness when he revealed that he had production magic. As everyone started to feel down all of a sudden, Van immediately changed the subject, telling everyone that they're going to fortify the defensive wall to prevent more attacks. Although the wooden fence looks tough, but one flaming arrow would bring it down for good, which same for the houses. With that said, Van and his team started to brainstorm on what they should do to ensure everyone in the village would be safe in the next attack. Esparta is assigned to create an earthwork wall, while D is assigned to build a moat and make some pitfall traps and snares to prepare the village for the next attack. Then lastly, Van asks Mayor Rhonda to gather the villagers as he would like to say hello to them and explain everything. When everyone's finally gathered, Van went ahead and told everyone about the plan. Knowing that the villagers may see him as someone who is not capable of leading a large group, considering he is still a kid, he assures everyone that with the best knights, servants, and scholars behind him, everything will eventually work out. That the next time the bandits come at them, they're gonna make this village a bountiful one. However, before anything else, a villager grabbed this opportunity to ask Van about the taxes. Without hesitation, Van lowered the taxes from 30% to 10%, shocking everyone. In case his father says it's not enough, Van is willing to cover the difference from his own pocket. But aside from the taxes, the villagers also wonder why the Marquis can't just send knights to protect them, considering the bandits could show up again any day. Aside from the fact that requesting knights could take weeks before getting approved, since the village is regarded as an afterthought, there is a high chance that the Marquis would not even care to send one knight at all. Hearing this, before things escalate, Van explains to everyone that he understands their anger. However, he made them understand that the Marquis governs a massive territory, which means the Marquis's knights and money are both finite, so sending out small groups of knights might accomplish nothing more than getting them murdered. But in cases that the Marquis could spare them some of his knights, it would have to be at least 200 men, which means the village will have to prepare food, horses, weapons, tools, and funding. So if Van would be blunt about it, hiring mercenaries would cost even more. That is why, to ensure everyone's safety for now, Van asks Esparta to create an earth wall inside the wooden wall, completely shocking every villager. Now that the villagers have already seen how talented Van's men are, the only thing that Van needs to do is persuade the villagers to fight alongside them. He truly believes that if all the villagers rise to the occasion alongside them, the village will be reborn, far stronger than it ever was before. Since they just recently got here, Van and his team had no choice but to live off their carriage and camp outside, while they still don't have a house to stay in yet. Although Van managed to make his best appeal, half of the villagers looked like they weren't on board yet. So to ensure that he earns the villagers' trust and helps them live a thriving, enjoyable life, Van first needs to do his best in protecting these people from the bandits. Somehow, Van made it a goal to protect this village with his production magic, since this is the only way he can live an easygoing yet enjoyable life, something that he has been yearning to experience for years now. As they passed by, Van and his crew eventually managed to adjust to the country life. Knowing that protection is not enough, while they still have time, Van takes this opportunity to talk to Mayor Ronder regarding the offenses they should make in case of their new attackers. Since the villagers have only been using spears to attack the bandits through the gaps in the wooden wall, which is something that the enemies themselves can do back to them, Van suggested that they should start using catapults. These types of devices are only used in castle sieges and are not for defensive use, which is why the mayor is not quite aware of what it is. Dee quickly went ahead and explained that catapults are devices that throw big rocks, which are used to destroy castle walls, watchtowers, and other large immobile buildings. However, Van has another idea on how they can utilize this device in defending the village. He theorized that as long as they load the catapult with a bunch of smaller rocks, the area of impact widens, which means that if they place the device in a position where it would land on attackers at the gate, it would be quite effective as a long-range defense mechanism. None of the adults even thought of a plan like this, so when they found out that it was all Van's idea, everyone went silent for a minute. Although aware that his production magic inspires zero faith in anyone, Van still tries his best to learn and understands it better. On their way to the village, Van was already trying to practice his magic and learn to freely change the shape of wood, rocks, metal, and so on. Now that he has finally learned the basics, Van is ready to unveil what this ability can do. As the crew finally went on to start their first quest in the forest, gathering all the materials they needed for the plan, Van tells Ortho that his party can now leave if they want, since their job here is already done. Ortho is quick to explain that they planned on staying for a bit since they find the situation quite interesting, adding that they also want to stick around to hunt for Magica beasts as well. Then suddenly, Ortho hears a soft rustle, which immediately alerted him. So to ensure Van's safety, Ortho went ahead and checked the situation himself. While Ortho is busy at that, Van and the others started collecting the materials they needed. After gathering as many woods as they could, Van went ahead and tried his production magic for real this time. He visualizes his desired object and focuses his mana on it, while also relaxing himself, making sure to let the mana flow to his fingertips. Eventually, after imagining each and every fiber of the wood, separating them into tinier and tinier threads, Van finally managed to create an amazing wooden block. First time seeing this kind of material, Till immediately asks her master what kind of material this is. This block is a wood fiber block that is like nanofibers. Since microfibers produce stronger results than processing wood directly, Van wanted to try making all kinds of things with this. Osvan finishes creating the wooden blocks. Ortho and his crew finally arrives after investigating. Just like Kamshin and Till, Ortho was quite amazed at Van's new invention, as it is lighter and harder than any ordinary wood. So to test the strength of the wood, Ortho tried cutting it using his sword. But no matter how much effort he made, he couldn't cut the wood at all. With this, Van is happy that they actually managed to gain some durable materials that they can use against the attackers. Now that Van had finally realized he had a limitless potential with his magic, on their way back to the village, Van ended up creating more objects, making everyone worried that he might run out of mana. But surprisingly, Van doesn't feel like he is. Van is not even satisfied with creating small sophisticated objects that he ended up creating weapons both for Till and Kamshin. Although Van doesn't know much about this man and depletion stuff, he can't help but get amazed at his production magic, especially now that he realized it's actually quite useful. In fact, it's way more useful than he thought. Using the new material that Van made, the group finally made their first village home. On top of that, because of how well made the material is, the group only took half a day to build the giant wall. Thanks to the help of Esparta, Van's work definitely became a lot easier. After realizing that he can do more using his production magic, Van ended up creating more objects using his magic. After all, no one can use creation magic as powerful as Van's. Aside from ensuring that everyone was safe, Van went ahead and focused on the village wall. After all, for him, the key to preventing enemy invasion is the wall. That is why he wants to focus on making his wooden blocks heavier. But aside from wood, Van manages to create metal objects as well. By the end of the day, everyone was surprised by how massive Van made the wall look like. To check if the walls he created are sturdy enough to protect them all, Van asks Ortho to attack the door with his sword. No matter how hard and fast Ortho's attacks are, he only manages to leave a scratch on the wall. Knowing that he did his all, Ortho can't help but wonder what went wrong. The next day, waking up in this cramped place, with his bed only as wide as his body, Van feels nasty as he hasn't been taking showers for long now, making him wonder if he is an adventurer or a noble. After getting ready, he finally went outside to check how the others were doing. Both Kamshin and Till are doing their chores. Although they may look fine, Van knows that they are in the same situation as he is, exhausted and all. Therefore, Van decided that before strengthening the village defense, he will have to prepare food, clothes, and shelter for everyone, and even build a house. Immediately, using the blocks he created, Van created their first home in this village. He first started with the pillars, followed by the four sides, to determine the size. With a detailed blueprint in his head, Van feels like this home will be bigger than how he actually imagined it to be. After finalizing the outer parts of the house, Van went on to start creating the inner partition walls and used up all the wood blocks to complete the framework of the house. Aside from making the inner rooms sophisticated, Van also made sure to do the same with the outdoor design. After a few seconds, Van created the largest manor the villagers had ever seen. Because of how good Van is at this, even Kamshin is convinced that Van's creation magic is much more suitable for lords than a four-element magic. Although Kamshin has a point, Van still acknowledges the fact that strong attack magic is best for protecting a territory overall, and people living with such a lord would be safer. Till and Esparta immediately disagree with their master, with Esparta explaining that those strong attack spells are only useful in times of war. However, if there is no enemy threat, Esparta strongly believes that Van can still improve the lives of his residents. Since the people were surprised by what Van made, they grabbed this opportunity to raise concerns regarding the terrible conditions of their houses. As the leader, Van ended up doing major renovations for the village, since for him, if his creation magic can make everyone in the village happy, then he has no choice but to give everyone the comforting home they all deserve to have. For the next hour, Esparta and the villagers built a protective wall, while Dee and Ortho and their friends went on to collect wood. Van, together with Till and Kamshin, then started working on the renovation of the villagers' houses. After a while, Van managed to get used to it, causing him to produce houses much faster than before. But he can't deny the fact that the feeling of doing what he is asked for, over and over, is quite depressing, making him remember the feeling of being a corporate slave. Now that he is already the lord of this place, Van has also taken into consideration the layout of the houses for a more organized neighborhood. Based on his plan, 4 houses are grouped together, and the larger streets are laid out in a lattice pattern. This layout is based on an approach called the grid plan, which will enable the villagers to expand and move things around from now on. Van also made sure that he built all the villagers' houses the same, so they would be equal. But when the day comes, Van still plans on rebuilding them to fit each family. Despite the minimalistic approach of Van, the villagers were extremely grateful for everything he had done. In fact, when he goes out, the villagers bow and give him some gifts. But aside from the houses, he also made a simple bathhouse next to the Lord's mansion. With the help of Pluriel's water magic, they were able to fill the basin and light an old-fashioned fire to warm the water. After taking a bath, Van was excited to finally sleep in a big room, until he realized that he didn't have any furniture at all, with him almost sleeping in those dirty old camping bags again. So hastily, he decided to make a simple hay bed with the straw from the villagers. Because of this, Van finally slept well after weeks of suffering in a camping bag. The next day, Van looks really happy eating his breakfast at his own home, but his slow morning suddenly becomes stressful when he finally does his duties as a leader. During his early meeting with Esparta, it was discussed that although the safety of the village is important, but they still have to deal with the problem of regular income. Based on what Esparta heard, the almost monthly peddler is the only way to communicate with the outside world, which means they'll have a hard time getting things they need. So Van thought of another way to solve this problem. Using his magic, he plans on preparing houses, furniture, and clothes. Regarding the food, Van also has a plan for that as well. So he personally thinks that they should focus more on strengthening their defenses. But when Esparta revealed that they have no spices and ingredients for Van's favorite baked sweets, Van's expression suddenly changed. And from wanting to just strengthen their defenses, Van is now starting to act all mature and tries to think of products they can sell outside, which will enable them to trade other products from other villages. Kamshin immediately went to suggested that they could sell the wooden blocks Van created the other day, but Van immediately rejected that suggestion since he is the only one who can make those. Till then went ahead and suggested that they should hunt and collect monster materials, which they can sell for a good price. But Van is still against this idea since he doesn't want to take what Ortho hunts to be used for the village. So at this point, the only option they have is to sell crops and such, but it is difficult to do considering the characteristics of the village. On top of that, Esparta also thinks that it wouldn't make such a big profit, which means they have to think of a better way to pull this plan off. In the meantime, Van went on to have a meeting with his team and even created Ortho's party member, Kusara, a new weapon to use. Together with Kamshin and Till, Van wants the two to undergo training with the help of Kusara. Although Van does appreciate that the two treasure the gifts he gave them, but he also reminded the three that they'd better try it to know the limits, or else they can't really protect themselves during an emergency. Kusara then went on to showcase his skills and showed off his Orc Knight shield, stating that it is a shield made of leather from its shoulders and back, a very exceptional item that is both sturdy and flexible. So as a starter, he encourages Kamshin to try hitting it. Although at first Kamshin's hits were a little light, Kusara was stunned when he realized that his brand new shield ended up getting sliced in half with Kamshin's light hits. Seeing how devastated Kusara is, Van immediately went on to mend it for him, making it stronger than it was. Then all of a sudden, Ortho enters the scene, trying to sell Van some ores he was able to gather back in the forest. Ortho was just wandering in the forest ends, at the foot of the Wolfsburg Mountains, where he found that there were many formidable monsters there. Thanks to them, he was able to collect rare ores without going deep into the mountains. To make it even better, Ortho also managed to get a mithril ore, which is something that Van can use in making amazing items. But for some reason, Van finds it odd that other adventurers haven't mined these ores yet, so Ortho speculated that it may be because these ores and medical herbs were located far away from the main trail and were inconvenient to look for, so only a few knights have explored them. With these ores, Van went on to create an iron ore, which he made into an iron block. With this, Kusara was dazzled and started asking Van if he could create him a thin, double-edged blade sword using it. Since Kusara was the one who brought this ore as well, Van decided to provide weapons to all the adventurers. Just like what he did to the wooden block, Van went ahead and used the iron ore to create his first iron weapon. With much concentration, he wants the blade of this sword to be thicker than a katana, but the edge should be as sharp as possible. Since he already has a feeling that the density of the metal will be important, he decided to make it tightly condensed for now. Within just a couple of minutes, Van finally created his first weapon, and he immediately handed it to Kusara. Because of how beautifully made Kusara's sword is, the others immediately went ahead and begged Van to make them one as well. Even Pluriel is astonished by how beautifully and meticulously the sword is, to the point that she can't even evaluate it fully until she uses it. On top of that, this sword can also be considered as rare, since according to Esparta, finding this type of ore in lumps is not that common at all. So it is notable that if someone is near a dungeon, they will tend to hear stories about stone golems or iron golems that produce these ores. However, no one really found any golem remains, but if there were, people speculated that the golems had crumbled long ago. Because of this, the group can't help but wonder if the fortune inside that dungeon will actually change the state of their village, causing Van to get interested in finding that dungeon as soon as possible. A dungeon is a paradise full of resources and treasures. Lots of weapons, accessories, and the country's artifacts were taken from the dungeons, which is why they are now so important to everyone. Adventurers have to report to the guild if they have ever found a new dungeon, and there is a rule that if the guild receives a report of a new dungeon, they will quickly open a branch in the nearest town or village. Which simply means, finding a new dungeon is an amazing achievement for adventurers. It is a good opportunity to raise one's name, and they can also get into the best adventurous circle. Aside from that, they will also have the right to become the first person to explore the dungeon, which will give them the highest chance to actually get as many treasures as they want. So if the village makes a report about the dungeon in a situation like this, Van knows that they can't afford to accept the guild's people just yet. On top of that, the village would also be filled with adventurers, merchants, and even knights, and considering the village is already short on food and other resources, there is no way they would be able to accommodate more people. But the worst of all is the chance that the neighboring country will eventually attack them because of their newfound resources, which is why Van has decided not to search for a dungeon just yet. But Van wanted to expand and build the village before claiming any dungeon, since with this, his brothers and father would not be able to take the village away from him. Which is why Van immediately started executing his plan by hiring laborers who would make a stock of shields and weapons before the merchants arrived. But aside from their massive concrete wall, Van also put some simplified ballistas as part of their defense. This ballista has a shield in front of it, and it can shoot a bolt without being afraid of counterattacks. On top of this, Van also made towers around the village where he put most of the ballistas. While Till is preparing dinner, Van goes on to have a serious talk with Kamshin, who is patrolling at the top of the towers. As a loyal servant, Kamshin feels a little disappointed that all that he could do to help Van was bring him some stones to transform. Van immediately assures him that there is nothing to be disappointed about since doing mostly everything is all part of his duty as their lord. Now that they're already at it, Van went on to ask Kamshin if he had any goals he wanted to achieve soon, and without hesitation, Kamshin answered his question with much dedication, stating that he wants to protect Van at all costs. His serious expression almost made Van fall in love with him. But kidding aside, Van couldn't deny how he really appreciates Kamshin for being straightforward and caring towards him. So as a gift, he decided to make him some armor later. Eventually, for the next 3 days, Van worked really hard to make the village look like a small fort. At this point, no bandits would ever dare to invade this village anymore. Seeing how well things have become, Dee is starting to feel a bit sad that the Marquis is not aware of Van's true power. Esparta immediately steps in, somehow defending the Marquis that the head of the family only considers the ability to fight to be the most important thing. So it is not up to them to decide whether what conspired is right or wrong. Dee then quickly went on to explain that he finds Van's abilities great in battle, so if they just give it some time, Dee is certain that Van would be stronger than anyone else. As the discussion went further, Van steps in, telling them that there is no need to argue regarding his abilities as there's nothing they can do about it. When finally the atmosphere had relaxed a bit, the group went ahead and started working on the moat. Moats are good for defenses, with a little aesthetic effect. But aside from defenses, Van also plans to use this moat to collect drinking water for everyone. To do that, they need to strengthen the trench's bottom and the wall, as well as find a route to draw water. However, something unexpected happened as the bandits finally came, and they were coming from the other side of the impasse. Immediately, everyone went to their positions with Van ordering the bridge to be raised and the gates to be closed. To Van's surprise, even though it's only been a few days, but the villagers have now been following his orders without protest, except they are still afraid to fight. So, as a lord, Van doesn't want to burden his people by looking afraid. With such assuring words, Van tells his men not to be afraid, as this fight is important for the future of the village, while adding that he will also fight alongside everyone just to protect the village, no matter what. Because of this, everyone in the group started moving immediately, preparing to fight these bandits at the entrance. But before Van could even go and take his place, Till tried to stop him. But with his reassuring eyes, Till eventually let go of his hand in the end. While the enemies are still outside, Van asks Dee to investigate the enemy's plan while he leads from behind. With much confidence, Dee knows that he'll definitely win any fight, especially now that it's for the sake of the village and their leader, Van. Just as Van asked him to do, Dee went on to check the perimeters and see just how many enemies they have. Based on his observation, there are about 50 to 100 bandits approaching them. But something unexpected suddenly revealed itself. As it turned out, these bandits are actually chased by an armored dragon, and there are so many of them approaching the village. Upon seeing this, Dee immediately knew they were in such a bad situation, knowing that even experienced knights would have a hard time fighting these creatures. For sure, villagers who don't have proper training wouldn't be able to defeat these creatures, no matter how much effort they put in. So immediately, Dee went on to inform Van about it, so Van started thinking of a plan on how they'd be able to defeat these monsters in one go. Although magic would be effective, but with Esparta and Pluriel being the only two people who can use magic, there is no way they'd be able to defeat these monsters at all. So Van thought of a plan to restrain the movements of these creatures and slash them at their weak points to annihilate them. Aside from that, Van also quickly thought of the fact that the villagers couldn't possibly withstand the attack of the dragon's tail and paws, so he immediately orders everyone to change the ballista's arrow and load the iron arrow beside it. After hearing this, Dee is having doubts that these arrows would do the job. But then he reminded himself that he had decided to follow Van's lead from now on, so without hesitation, he asked every soldier in place to do exactly as Van said. Despite this fight being one of the deadliest fights Dee has ever led, he tried to lessen the tension by cracking a joke, encouraging everyone to fight with effort so that they'll have dragon skewers for dinner. As the monsters finally got close, the bandits started jumping into the moat, trying to save their precious lives. Van then orders his men to shoot their arrows directly at the monsters, but to their surprise, this is more challenging than they thought it would be. As they start to lose hope, Dee manages to notice something spectacular when he takes a closer look at the creatures they managed to hit. To his surprise, they actually managed to murder about 10 armored dragons in one volley, completely showcasing that Van's plan actually worked. So, without wasting a minute, Dee asks the other villagers to bring them more arrows, with Van suggesting that they should use the wooden arrows instead. With this, everyone suddenly gained more confidence, and Dee is certain that their second salvo will be even more accurate than before. The people on the watchtowers have also set up and taken positions, guaranteeing them that they will gain victory in the end. Van didn't fail to surprise Dee again when his suggestion of using wooden arrows instead of iron ones resulted in them murdering more creatures than before. To ensure that they'll end this battle once and for all, Dee asks everyone to use wooden arrows starting now. After a while, the villagers managed to defeat all the armored dragons, ultimately claiming victory in the end. Dee couldn't help but feel happy, just thinking that if he told Commander Stradale about this, no one would believe him. Dee feels so proud of Van for growing up this fast. Although it is hard to imagine, Van indeed grew into a fine man. Van then rushes towards Dee, thanking him for his hard work. When Van finally looked at the battlefield, he himself couldn't believe that they actually managed to defeat these dinosaur-looking monsters. But aside from the monsters, the village still needs to take care of the bandits who managed to survive. Knowing that they'll become slaves or be put to prison for the rest of their lives, the bandits tried to beg Van to let them stay in the village and serve them. However, the villagers were quick to stand up and refuse their suggestions, since these are the same bandits who had hurt and taken away the lives of their loved ones before. As one of the villagers is about to punch the leader of the bandits, Van was quick to stop him from making his hands dirty, while also assuring the villagers that, as their leader, he will be the one taking care of the rest. Since Van still wants to follow the path of justice, he decided to turn over these bandits to the official ones when someone comes to the village. Until then, Van wants them to contribute for the sake of the village. For now, Van asks them to butcher the armored dragons into many pieces. Over the following days, Dee, Orthos' team, and Kamshin, together with the people who were free, dealt with the carcasses. Eventually, after 3 days, they were able to finish dealing with the bodies and went on to have a feast the next night. Now they don't have to worry about money and can use any seasonings because of the materials they were able to gather from the armored dragons. Since this is the first time that Van has ever tasted dragon meat, he couldn't deny how deliciously tender and juicy it is. The meat inside is fatty and tasty because it is protected by a hard shell, which is maybe why dragons are expensive when sold. In the midst of this celebration, Dee was a bit sad when he found out that Van actually gave the swords to the adventurers, so Dee, together with his members, also begged Van to make them one as well. But Van was quick to avoid the conversation and went on to talk with the other villagers instead. As the night finally got deep, every villager had now grown fond of their new leader and had decided to help Van in improving this village. Ortho and Van then went on to have a talk regarding the money they'll be able to earn from these dragon body parts. According to Ortho, one dragon with a shell, the merchant usually gives 20 gold coins for a price. But since most of the meat they have now is rotten, they can't possibly be able to sell it at that price. Instead, they'll get around 8 gold coins in total, but still, the village will be rich in an instant. Although this is good news, Van is worried that his father might eventually learn about the true state of their village. As someone who is trying to live a normal life, Van plans on keeping this whole thing under wraps. So to do that, Esparta suggested that Van tell his brother Mersha about this first and credit him with the dragons. After much consideration, Van decided to go with Esparta's suggestion in the end. The next day, many of the villagers became so benevolent, thanking Van for his help the other day. Van was holding Till's hand all the time. However, when he realized that this made him look small, he tried letting go. At that moment, Van starts to feel sad at the thought that someday, Till will eventually leave him and be with someone else. Seeing how downhearted her master is, Till quickly assures Van that she wants to take care of him and keep being with him forever. So Van holds her hand tightly again while looking all flustered. As they went to check one of the towers, one of their men informed them that merchants were coming their way. But since they are not certain about it yet, Van orders to raise the bridge and prepare the ballista just in case. Now this confuses everyone since these people are just merchants and not bandits, so they don't really get why Van is being too cautious. With such a bubbly expression, Van tells everyone that they need to do a lot of things, and it depends on how he effectively uses each opportunity. Knowing that the people coming their way are merchants, Van wants to use this opportunity to show off. As the merchants finally got close, they were a bit skeptical if this was the village they were meant to go to, since the way it looked now was far different than what it looked like before. Although in wonder if they happened to miss a turn, they still went forward with their wagons. As they get to the front gate, Van introduces himself to them and asks the merchants to state their names and positions to verify if they are the merchants the village is waiting for. After hearing Van's name, the merchants immediately knew who he was and how Van was regarded as the young prodigy of the Ferdio family. Despite knowing that geniuses are shunned, the merchants were not expecting that Van would be that talented for the Marquis to personally send him to the border. Despite being confused, the merchants still went on to do as Van ordered them and introduced themselves as Merchant Mary Bell and Lango, together with their security guard adventurer, Air. After confirming with Ortho if he knew these people, Van then gave them permission to enter the village. As soon as the merchants finally get in, Van immediately asks them if they can sell their dragon shell parts. Now this stunned the life out of the two merchants to the point that they started getting all flustered with the great news. Their bodies started trembling when Van showed them the warehouse where they stored all the dragon parts, with their eyes showing how much they couldn't believe this was even possible. While the two are still in awe, Van informs them that the villagers have pacified about 40 dragons with shells and arrested about 30 people. With this amount of parts and people, the merchants estimated that it would take them at least 1 month to take care of this whole thing, which is something Van already predicted. But for now, Van wants everyone to eat some meat first and enjoy their stay. Now that Van has mentioned it, knowing that those lumps of meat will eventually rot in the end, the merchants ask Van if he would like them to sell those meats to the neighboring villages. But Van found out that those villages are in poverty, so he decided to just give the meat away for free, shocking the merchants. To assure that the merchants will still have profits of their own, Van suggested that they should come to the village again in the future, while promising them a deal they won't regret. To show off some of the high-quality weapons he made, Van went on to take the merchants to the storage room where they kept them. As soon as the visitors land their eyes on these items, they can't deny that there are really awesome high-quality weapons anyone dreams of having. Although the merchants have not yet figured out the intricacies of the advantages of weapons, but just looking at how amazing this exhibit is, they knew it would be worth so much. So Ortho asked Air to try one of the weapons if he wanted to. To Air's surprise, the blade immediately cut right through the dragon's dragon skin. After witnessing this, the merchants ended up buying a few of the weapons alongside other goods in the village. When the night finally bites, the merchants can't help but express how amazed they are at the improvement of the village. Belle even suggested that they could ask the trade group to increase their number of visits to 2 each month so that they'll be able to trade with the village more often, which sounds good to Van. Now that they're already talking about this, Van asks the brothers if they could add some supplies and sake on their next visit, as this will make the villagers more cheerful. In addition to this, Van also proposed a great idea that will be beneficial for both parties. For Van to avoid negotiating with various merchants, he just proposed to the brothers to open their own shop in the village, which would give them a stable income and the opportunity to have their own store. Also, to ensure that the brothers have a blissful stay, Van is even willing to build them a house. Since the idea is good and quite beneficial, the brothers didn't even hesitate and went on to make a deal with Van, with Belle deciding to stay in the village to open a store until things get better, eventually ending their negotiations. Now that's all for today's video. Comment Van if you want to see the next part of this series. Give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed it, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more content like this. As always, thanks for watching.